Another fun-filled lesson on intermediate C++. Today we will be covering namespaces. So get ready for more thrills and spills and pills. Okay, now up till now you've always seen the line in your code that says using namespace Std, your standard namespace, and it may have occurred to you is, why do I always have this line in there? Well, the reason why you always have that line there because you want the standard namespace to be your default. It doesn't have to be. As you get out into the world, you'll see a lot of programmers deliberately avoid that, and so instead of saying cout, they'll say std : cout. We'll see a little bit about that. What namespaces do for you: they prevent name collision. You can buy software from this vendor, you can buy software from that vendor, you can incorporate them both. This vendor has a function called add, because it's a very common word. He wants to use the word add because he wants to add stuff to his collection or data or whatever he's got. This guy's got something else says add. Well, how do you tell which add you want to use? Well, you come up with a namespace. You can have this guy that you bought his software from, he will have defined all of his names in a particular namespace that he will define unique to his company. He will have done the same thing for his company. You can bring them both together as long as you identify based on the namespace you're using. There's no collision of names. You don't cause problems. So we'll see how to define our own namespace, because you want to write some software, you might want to sell it to somebody, you need to put your stuff into a namespace. Now you can have as many compilation units all in the same namespace. You've got the unit of code, you've got the namespace, and they can overlap, and whatever it happens to work out best for you. You can have a compilation unit that has different namespaces in the same compilation unit. You can have different compilation units in the same namespace. You merge them any way that makes the most sense for your application. So we also have a scope operator for your class, which is not quite the same thing as a namespace, but looks like a namespace. But it doesn't work the same way as a namespace. So you can't use it to duplicate names in multiple compilation units quite so much. You can use it for your class definitions quite a bit. But you know, there's things where I have a variable, I have an integer in this compilation unit, and this is called A. You can't have the A in another compilation unit. Because it will go to the linker. It says, I'm looking for an A. I'm going to define an A here. This other compilation unit says, I'm going to define an A here. The A's will clash with each other. So it's more for your types and classes than for an actual class instance, your object instances. So you can use explicit scoping for you can say, I want to use a particular namespace. You can say, I want to use each one of these namespaces, and as long as the names that you use are unique between them, there you won't have any clashes. So that's what your using keyword does. It sets up your default namespace. Your explicit scoping is, I want to say std : cout, for example. So I don't want to have a using keyword. Like I say, many organizations deliberately avoid the using. They don't want to have any confusion at all. They don't want to run into an issue where they think of a wonderful name for their code. I want to have this particular function be called this, and find out it's already defined in the standard library someplace. So, geez, now we can't use that anymore. So they will very deliberately avoid putting a using on their code, and which is okay. It's a little cumbersome for the programmer because he has to type std : every time he uses something. But if that's the company policy, you go with the company policy. So you can specify a particular name. It says, I want cout to be from the standard library, so I'll define cout to be from the standard library. And there are strategies. There's a common strategy. There are uncommon strategies for deciding, okay, I'm going to sell this package. I'm going to have my namespace. What name do I give the namespace? We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about using namespace aliases, because after you come up with a name for your namespace that you know is unique, it might be a little long. The people using it says, I don't want to use that big old long namespace. I want a short namespace. Well, use an alias to define your short alias to a whatever the long namespace alias happens to be. So the namespace uses the scope operator, which is 2 colons. It's an operator, incidentally, that cannot be overloaded. One of the few in C++ that you are stuck with. You can't say, well, I'm going to have : mean add in my... No, you can't do that. We've seen 2 types of namespaces. There's the std for the standard library, and in object-oriented programming we have seen where you can associate a class name with a class method using the same scope operator, which is not quite the same thing as a namespace, but it's similar. So it's advisable for packages intended to be included in development by other organizations. If you're never ever going to sell your code to anybody else, it's never ever going to be included in somebody else's package, you don't have to worry about it so much. But if you're doing that, what are you writing your code for? Well, I guess you're writing the entire application all by yourself. It's very likely though that your code will be included in someone else's code. You will get someone else's code to include in your code. So it's advisable to set up your namespace policy, because otherwise you want to avoid namespace collision. You don't want this guy to have a subtract method and you have your own subtract method, and you want to avoid the subtract being confused, or especially with classes. Company as a class name, every lesson, every class in computer science, every homework has got, okay, define a company object. Okay, well, somebody will have a company object. Define an employee class. You've got an employee, and we'll call it employees. Well, you bring in something and they define an employee, you bring in something else. They've also defined an employee class. You've got to tell these 2 employees apart. Well, you set up your namespace. So you separate the names according to the organization that the names are included in.